On the morning of June 30th, 1956, Captain Robert Shirley, in command of United Airlines Flight 718 aboard Douglas DC-7N6324C, departed Los Angeles International at 9:04 local time on the airway to Chicago. 31 minutes earlier, TWA Flight 2, a Lockheed L-1049. Super Constellation, registration N6902C, under the command of Captain Jack Gandy, had left Los Angeles on its own eastbound sector to Kansas City. Both aircraft were operating under visual flight rules in uncontrolled airspace over the American Southwest. Both had filed flight plans. Both were in radio contact with the airways system. Neither crew knew where the other aircraft was. At approximately 10:31 local time, over the eastern rim of the Grand Canyon, at an altitude of approximately 21,000 feet, N6324C and N6902C occupied the same piece of sky. The wreckage of both aircraft fell into the canyon. There were no survivors. The 128 people aboard the two flights, 70 on the United DC-7, 58 on the TWA Constellation, were all killed. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigation that followed would take months. What it established was not a story of pilot error or mechanical failure. It was a story about what the United States Airways system in 1956 did not know, could not see, and was not designed to manage. Two crews had flown their aircraft into the same airspace at the same altitude at the same time, and nothing in the system that existed on that morning had been capable of preventing it. Before you can understand what happened over the Grand Canyon on June 30th, 1956, you need to understand what the American airspace system was and was not in 1956. The United States had been operating scheduled airline services since the 1920s. By 1956, American carriers were flying millions of passengers a year on modern piston airliners, the Douglas DC-7, the Lockheed Super Constellation, at cruise altitudes between 19,000 and 25,000 feet, at speeds approaching 350 miles per hour. The volume of traffic in American airspace had grown dramatically in the decades since the end of World War II. The system that managed it had not kept pace. Airways, defined corridors of airspace connecting one radio navigation beacon to the next, were controlled. A flight operating on an airway, within the published altitude structure, was separated from other traffic on that airway by the controllers working the sector. But controlled airspace covered only a fraction of the American sky. Between the airways, and above 14,500 feet in most regions, lay uncontrolled airspace. Airspace in which no controller had authority, no separation service existed, and no radar coverage was available to see who was there. The standard for avoiding collision in this airspace was called see and avoid. The crew looked out the window. If they saw another aircraft, they maneuvered. If they did not see it, because it was above them, or behind them, or approaching head-on at a combined closing speed of 700 miles per hour. The system had no other answer. Now, consider what Captain Shirley and Captain Gandy had available to them in their cockpits that morning to know where the other aircraft was. They had nothing. No traffic information, no radar advisory, no transponder return visible to any ground station. Nothing. Before we continue, if this kind of aviation documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing to the channel. Every episode here follows a specific aircraft and a specific crew through a specific operation, with the instruments, the procedures, and the limitations of the era they were flying in. No aircraft worship, no simplified history, just the operational record, told as accurately as the sources allow. If that is what you want from aviation history, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And leave a comment. Did you fly in the United States in the 1950s? Professionally or in training? Do you have logbook entries, personal accounts, or family history connected to United Airlines, TWA, or the pre-FAA era of American aviation? The people who were there carry information that no published record fully captures. We want to hear from them. Now, back to the aircraft. N6324C was a Douglas DC-7, the most advanced piston airliner in American domestic service in 1956. Its four Wright R3350 turbo compound engines, each producing 3,250 horsepower at takeoff, gave it a cruise speed of approximately 360 miles per hour at altitude. United Airlines operated it on high-frequency transcontinental routes, Los Angeles to Chicago, Los Angeles to New York, where schedule performance and seat capacity drove the operation. N6324C had departed Los Angeles at 0904, carrying 66 passengers and a crew of 4. N6902C was a Lockheed L1049. Super Constellation, TWA's flagship on domestic routes, its four Wright R350 engines producing similar power, its distinctive triple tail and dolphin fuselage making it immediately recognizable in flight. The TWA Flight 2 had departed at 8:01, carrying 53 passengers and a crew of 5, bound for Kansas City with an intermediate stop at Amarillo. The routes that had been filed for both flights crossed the Grand Canyon region at approximately the same altitude, 21,000 feet. Both crews had requested altitude changes during the flight. The CAB investigation would establish that both aircraft were operating at 21,000 feet at the time of the collision, United at that altitude by clearance, TWA at that altitude by pilot request that had been acknowledged. Let me tell you what 21,000 feet over the Grand Canyon in VFR conditions in 1956 meant for what each crew could see. The sky was largely clear that morning. There was weather, build-ups over the desert southwest, and towering cumulus that crews routinely detoured around for passenger comfort and structural margin. The CAB investigation's reconstruction suggested that both aircraft may have been detouring around the same cloud formation from opposite sides. Each crew may have had their view of the converging track temporarily obscured by the cloud they were both avoiding. Neither crew transmitted a collision alert. Neither crew transmitted anything in the final seconds. The physical evidence recovered from the canyon floor would have to tell the story instead. The recovery operation at the Grand Canyon was among the most difficult the CAB had attempted. The wreckage of both aircraft had fallen into the inner canyon. Terrain accessible only by mule trail or helicopter. The summer heat at the canyon floor reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The investigation teams worked in conditions that had no parallel in the history of American accident investigation to that point. What they recovered established the collision sequence with sufficient clarity to reconstruct what had happened, if not to explain with certainty why neither crew had seen the other in time. The DC-7's left wing had struck the Constellation's rear fuselage and tail section. The Constellation's propellers had cut into the DC-7's left wing and fuselage. The contact was not head-on. It was a converging collision at a shallow angle, the kind of geometry that presents the smallest possible visual cross-section to each crew in the seconds before impact. The Constellation's tail section had separated first. The DC-7 had lost structural integrity in the left wing and entered an uncontrollable descent. A modern accident investigator reading the CAB report will note what was and was not available to that investigation. There was no cockpit voice recorder. There was no flight data recorder. The regulations of 1956 did not require them. The investigators had the wreckage, the filed flight plans, the radio transcripts, and the physical evidence of how the two aircraft had contacted each other. They did not have the last minutes of either cockpit. What the wreckage established was enough. The question the investigation could not fully answer, what each crew saw and when, and why the collision was not avoided, remained open. It remains open today. The CAB investigation's findings were published in April 1957. The probable cause it identified was the failure of both flight crews to see and avoid each other. While the finding was technically accurate, it was also functionally incomplete. A modern air traffic controller reading the 1956 CAB report will note immediately what the report's probable cause does not address. The crews could not have been expected to see and avoid each other in the geometry of the collision at the closing speeds involved, with the visual obstruction that the cloud buildups provided. See and avoid. As a separation standard requires that aircraft be visible to each other with enough time and distance to maneuver. The physics of a converging collision at high speed in conditions of partial visual obstruction did not provide that margin. The system had placed both aircraft in the same airspace at the same altitude and then relied on the crews to solve a problem that the geometry of the situation made unsolvable. Is what the collision had revealed was not a crew failure. It was a system design failure, a failure that would have produced the same outcome regardless of the experience, the alertness, or the professional competence of the crews involved. The sky over the Grand Canyon on June 30th, 1956 was a place where two large piston airliners could occupy the same coordinates at the same moment, and nothing in the system would know, and nothing would prevent it. The question the CAB's probable cause finding left open, and the question that Congress, the airlines, and the aviation industry had to answer after the investigation closed, was what to do about a system that had been overtaken by the volume of traffic it was managing. The answer would take 2 years to produce. It would restructure American aviation from the ground up. On August 23, 1958, 2 years and 54 days after the Grand Canyon collision, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aviation Act into law. The Act created the Federal Aviation Agency, later the Federal Aviation Administration, as a single independent authority with jurisdiction over all of American civil and military airspace. It was the most significant restructuring of American aviation governance since the Air Commerce Act of 1926. The Federal Aviation Act did what the CAB's probable cause finding had avoided recommending directly. It acknowledged that the system of uncontrolled airspace, voluntary pilot reports, and paper strip separation had reached the limit of what it could safely manage. The new agency was given authority and mandate to develop the infrastructure. Radar, transponders, controlled airspace, positive separation at altitude. That would make a repetition of the Grand Canyon collision structurally impossible. The transition took years. Radar coverage of the continental United States airspace was not achieved overnight. Transponder carriage requirements were phased in across the fleet. The positive control area, airspace above 24,000 feet in which all aircraft are required to operate under instrument flight rules and radar separation, was established and progressively expanded. The air traffic control system that exists today, with its radar surveillance, its transponder returns, its traffic collision avoidance systems aboard every commercial aircraft, is the direct institutional descendant of the legislation that the Grand Canyon collision made politically unavoidable. N6324C does not exist. Its wreckage is in the canyon, non-recoverable, not preserved. N6902C is in the same canyon. The 128 people who were aboard those two aircraft on the morning of June 30th, 1956, did not die because of a mistake that could have been avoided with more care or more skill. They died in a system that was not designed to keep them alive at the altitude and in the airspace where they were flying. The system that replaced it was designed specifically to prevent what happened to them. The wreckage of N6324C and N6902C remains in the Grand Canyon. Recovery of the human remains was conducted in 1956 under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The aircraft themselves, the metal of the airframes, the engines, the instruments, are where they fell. No aircraft from either flight exists in any museum. The Grand Canyon collision is not commemorated by a monument that most visitors to the canyon will find. What remains is the record of what those two aircraft revealed. Captain Robert Shirley had flown for United Airlines for more than a decade before June 30th, 1956. He was experienced on the DC-7. He had flown the Los Angeles to Chicago route many times. On the morning of the collision, he was operating his aircraft exactly as the system required, under visual flight rules in uncontrolled airspace, responsible for his own separation from other traffic by visual observation. He did what the system asked of him. The system asked something the geometry of the situation made impossible. Captain Jack Gandy had the same experience and faced the same impossibility on the same morning. Every flight in American airspace today operates within a system of radar surveillance, transponder identification, and positive separation that did not exist on June 30th, 1956. Every controller who works a sector today has a radar picture of who is in that sector. Every commercial aircraft carries a transponder that makes it visible to that radar. Every commercial aircraft carries a traffic collision avoidance system that will alert the crew if another aircraft enters their protected airspace envelope and tell them which way to turn. None of those things existed over the Grand Canyon on the morning of June 30th, 1956. All of them exist because of what happened there. If this is the kind of aviation history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. More aircraft, more crews, more operations, more of what the record actually shows. And if you have a connection to what you just watched, a logbook entry from this era, a family member who flew for United Airlines or TWA in the 1950s, a connection to anyone aboard either flight, a document or photograph that fills in a gap in the record, tell us in the comments. Which aircraft? Which airline or unit? Which years? What the operational reality was from the inside. The crews who flew these aircraft kept aviation moving forward through the most technically demanding period in the industry's history. Their operational knowledge deserves a record. We want to contribute to that record.